To give us a bigger picture on capitalism, actually the critique on modern capitalism and sweeping polemic against the market economy, we invited Grace Blakeley. And I think that Grace is the perfect speaker, keynote speaker today to make us think on how to avoid economic blackmail by the markets and protect the economy from financial flow. So let us reclaim economy.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for that incredible introduction. It's a real delight to be here and to be talking to you today about rebuilding the economy. And in doing so, I'm going to be drawing on a lot of the ideas in my new book, The Corona Crash, How the Pandemic Will Change Capitalism, which you can get online from all good bookstores. It's published by Verso in the UK. So the post-pandemic world is going to be starkly more unequal than the world of just 2 years ago, which was already beset by a huge number of socioeconomic challenges in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008. It will be a world crippled by debts, beset by speculation, and one in which many people will be desperately struggling to access healthcare, and not just the COVID-19 vaccine. Most of all, it will be a world hurtled toward breakdown. This may sound pessimistic, but the one message I want the audience to walk away with today is that it doesn't have to be this way. All over the world, the recovery from the 2008 financial crisis was characterized by stagnation of wages, productivity, and investment. In fact, the economic slowdown that has been so evident since 2008 predated the financial crisis, but it was concealed by the huge returns generated in finance, real estate, and professional services. Larry Summers, an economist and former US Treasury official, has termed this trend secular stagnation. Over the last 40 years, nearly every wealthy economy has seen the share of national income taken by workers fall substantially. Wealth and income inequality has risen as the labour share has fallen. Globalization and financialization still allowed for high growth rates before 2008, but after the crash, globalization went into retreat and the finance sector collapsed. After this point, global growth was buoyed only by incredibly cheap credit and public investment undertaken by developmental states in the global south and extraordinarily policy interventions in the global north. Central bankers were forced to keep the economy on life support through ultra-low interest rates and quantitative easing. But even with monetary policy so loose, businesses still weren't investing. Indeed, the main effect of low interest rates was to inflate a debt bubble 3 times the size of world GDP. Many economists were predicting that a recession would hit the US, the UK, and the Eurozone by 2022. We were still living in the shadow of the last crisis and the response to it when the pandemic hit, and the world economy could scarcely have been worse prepared. As we just saw in the trailer for that brilliant documentary, the growth of precarious work and self-employment, false self-employment often, left many workers vulnerable to under or unemployment before the introduction of furlough schemes around the world in response to the pandemic. High levels of household debt and low levels of savings, particularly among poorer families, meant that balance sheets were very fragile. Many of the millions of workers who suffered a loss of income when lockdown was introduced found themselves on the brink of homelessness and bankruptcy. Corporate debt was also very high when the pandemic hit, the legacy of more than a decade of very loose monetary policy. Businesses, particularly the less creditworthy ones, had taken advantage of low interest rates to increase their borrowing, often without directing this towards productive investment. Economists had identified a number of zombie companies, firms that could only afford to repay the interest on their outstanding debt out of their earnings in the years before the crisis hit. After a decade of austerity in the UK and most of the Eurozone, public services in many economies were stretched to breaking point at the start of 2020. In the UK, the combination of austerity, privatisation, and ill-thought-out reform agendas had had an acute impact on the NHS. Local government had seen its central government funding cut in half since 2010. The disastrous attempt to roll out universal credit had pushed many families to the brink of starvation. Food bank usage in the UK rose by 30% in areas where this reform to the social security system had been implemented. Austerity wasn't simply barbaric. It gave us each fragile, unproductive, and unequal economies. Today, while there are few calls for a return to full-blown austerity, even the IMF is not advocating a return to such policies in the wake of the pandemic, there are still those who argue that the health of the nation must be sacrificed for the sake of economic growth. This was exactly the argument made by those for cuts in the wake of the financial. Hi everyone, I'm so sorry that I got cut out there. I have absolutely no idea what happened. I actually carried on just talking. So I've already delivered a lot of my speech already before I saw the call. I'm not exactly sure where I cut out, but I'm going to just start by talking about some of the challenges that the economy is going to be facing and that we're going to be facing as a result of the pandemic. I apologize if you've already heard this, but technical difficulties. What are we to do in the age of Zoom? Right, so I'll start by talking about the way in which the pandemic is deepening many of the challenges that the economy was already facing before the crisis. So first, inequality of all kinds. Within the rich world, income inequality will continue to increase as many millions of people struggle to re-enter the jobs market, putting downward pressure on wages after they've stagnated in the US and the UK and the Eurozone for a decade. McKinsey has warned that many of the jobs most at risk of automation are also those most at risk of the pandemic, meaning many jobs simply won't be recreated when the crisis is over. Women and Black people will suffer the most from these labour market outcomes. Wealth inequality, augmented by central banks desperately trying to hold up asset prices, will continue to blight our economies, preventing young people from acquiring assets. As a result of the unequal distribution of existing assets, intergenerational and regional inequality will continue to rise. And inequality between global North and South will balloon. The global South is already in the midst of the worst debt crisis in modern history, and without access to the vaccine, the pandemic will continue to ravage the poorest countries in the world, delivering horrors like that currently being witnessed in India. Second, economic instability. A huge amount of debt has been created in the global economy since the 1980s, and the response to the financial crisis was to conceal this source of instability by trying to create new debt on top of old. Before the pandemic began, the US was already facing a corporate debt bubble, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada a housing bubble, and China an almost everything bubble. In the absence of substantial increases in productivity in the real economy, unlikely in the context of low rates of investment, this debt overhang will continue to create more challenges. Third, and perhaps most importantly, a concentration of economic and political power. Large corporations, which benefit from close links with states and financial institutions, have been able to borrow huge amounts of money to buy up competitors and inflate their share prices. But small businesses have not fared so well. The process of creative destruction that usually governs capitalism deepens during moments of crisis. The weak, with low margins, high debts, and little access to information or patronage, tend to suffer most. When these businesses fail, they are bought up by their larger rivals, which tend to have the cash necessary to allow them to outlast the crisis, as well as strong links with the finance sector and government, which allow them to access support unavailable to their smaller rivals. As one Karl Marx wrote in Volume 1 of Capital, capital grows in one place to a huge mass in a single hand because it has in another place been lost by many. The pandemic will augment this trend towards market concentration as small businesses go under and large ones buy up their assets. States, meanwhile, are supporting this process rather than preventing it, whether through loans and subsidies to big business, extraordinarily loose monetary policy, or overt corruption of the kind seen in the UK recently. Fourth, the collapse in the functioning of our democratic institutions. As a result of all of these trends, rising inequality, economic instability, and the rising concentration of economic and political power, trust in democracy is at all-time lows. People realize that those in power don't represent them, and all attempts to democratize our political and economic institutions have collapsed, with no thanks to a media extraordinarily hostile to any political project that seeks to challenge the status quo. Fifth, the collapse of our natural environment. Climate breakdown is already with us, and it comes along with the degradation of all of our natural systems, from the water cycle to the nitrogen cycle to the food chain. Again, the global south will be dealing with these challenges far before the global north, and it will be easy for eco-fascists in the rich world to take advantage of the migration that results to impose reactionary politics. In the midst of a crisis as significant as this one, it is often said that everyone is a socialist. There are few politicians and economists calling for the state to step back, let businesses fail, banks go bust, and homeowners default on their mortgages. If socialism meant corporate welfare, then it's true we would be entering a massive socialist revival. But socialism is not corporate welfare. No matter how much a capitalist state spends on furlough schemes and business loans and infrastructure, it will never become a socialist state. The fundamental character of political power in any country is always determined by one thing: the balance of power between labor and capital, between workers and bosses, and the way in which this balance is institutionalized and managed, not least by the state. States all over the world are spending more because capital needs to spend more. State spending to support big business and big finance has become the norm in today's economic normal of stagnation and crisis. Capital is becoming used to massive bailouts, whether that means the state temporarily taking an equity stake in their businesses, providing them with cheap loans, or simply loosening monetary policy to such an extent that borrowing effectively becomes free. The problem is very obvious. Capitalism can no longer survive without extensive state support. In fact, it's probably never been able to survive without extensive state support. It's hard to imagine modern capitalism without central banks, financial and corporate regulation, and legal tools like limited liability and intellectual property. The spending currently being undertaken by states around the world will continue for as long as it continues to benefit the wealthy, and not for a minute longer. While it is unlikely that we will see a return to full-blown austerity in the wake of this pandemic, at least partly because there isn't much left to cut, the chorus of calls for fiscal retrenchment will return. The ideology of austerity is meant to convince us that periods of largesse and spending must be balanced by periods of retrenchment and cuts. The power of this narrative lies in the fact that it parallels the lived experience of most people under capitalism. If you go on a debt-fueled spending spree, eventually you'll have to pay the money back, or else. The same arguments used in the wake of the financial crisis will be used in the wake of this pandemic. In response, we must ask why working people are always the ones forced to pay for bailouts for big businesses and big corporations. If as a society, we really must pay the piper, then why should it be doctors and nurses, waiters and warehouse workers who bear the brunt? Why not make those corporations, bankers and investors who've benefited from state largesse return the favour, either through higher taxes on corporate profits and wealth, or through public ownership of those corporations that have received state support? The only way to deliver a robust recovery and to tackle all of the challenges I've outlined in this presentation will be to invest in decarbonising the economy, creating new jobs, and boosting productivity, as well as democratising our society to improve trust. The government needs to invest in jobs creation in areas like research and development, engineering and construction, and health and social care, which will both support the recovery and help us to deal with long-term issues like climate breakdown and demographic ageing. This investment should be paired with an expansion in public ownership, a transformation of the finance sector, and support for the labour movement to ensure that private firms do not reap most of the gains from state largesse. We also have the opportunity to use this moment to radically rethink the way we understand work. Germany's largest union, IG Metall, has already called for a 4-day week to save jobs. But a more expansive vision would push for a standard 4-day week with full pay throughout the economy to boost productivity, improve living standards, and support decarbonisation. A green stimulus package, in any case, is likely to create 3 times as many jobs as a brown one, and creating jobs in the care economy is disproportionately likely to support working class women as well as helping decarbonise. Given that we're about to enter a global South debt crisis even more severe than that of the 1980s, it's critical that these measures are replicated at a global level. Resources and technology must be transferred from north to south to support states dealing with the impact of the pandemic and climate change all at once. Ultimately, the only sustainable long-term solution will be a debt write-off for low-income countries. We must also make sure to democratise all of our political and economic institutions and build movements that can demand change and hold the powerful to account. Without civil society pushing politicians to do the right thing, they will simply continue to serve the interests of big business. It's also critical that we reinvigorate democracy by, for example, subjecting central banks to democratic scrutiny, decentralizing political power, and extending the principles of political democracy into the realm of the economy. These challenges are enormous, and those in power have little incentive to tackle them because they've managed to insulate themselves from accountability to the majority. Without much challenge from the left, and without an organized working class capable of demanding change, those at the top have instead fought meaningless culture wars rather than addressed the issues that we face. By far the biggest challenge we face is that most people do not believe that the world could be any different. Capitalism is here, it works for powerful elites in both the public and private sectors, and they're unlikely to do anything to change it. As a result, many working people have simply stopped engaging with politics altogether. Our challenge then is to convince people that another world is possible, that we do not have to sleepwalk into a frightening dystopia simply because those in power will not take the difficult decisions needed to change the world. As soon as people start to believe that change is possible, they will act on it. They'll organize in their workplaces, in their communities, and on the streets. And politicians will be forced to pay attention. I firmly believe that we are entering into a new age of collective action, organizing, and civil disobedience. Many movements that have sought radically to transform our economy in the interest of the many, from Sanders in the US, Corbyn in the UK, Podemos, Syriza, Correa, have failed. But from the action we've seen on our streets over the course of the pandemic, from Black Lives Matter to Extinction Rebellion, it's quite clear that the hope and faith in radical change that these movements catalyzed is not over. People have had a taste of what it feels like to challenge the status quo, and they are not likely to forget it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace. This is fantastic. I took some notes and I'm like, yes, return the favor. Yes, democratizing societies for more trust. Yes, yes, yes. So this is wonderful. I have two things because I was also cut in my intro, so to speak. I wanted to say you're not only an economics commentator, but you are also an author. And you wrote these two books, The Corona Crash, How the Pandemic Will Change Capitalism, last year, and the one before, Stolen, How to Save the World from Financialization. And I encourage to read The Corona Crash, of course, because of the consequences on capitalism, on pandemics on capitalism. This is good. But I have a short question. I know we are running late, but I have to ask you this question. Stolen. You said Stolen is a history of island-led growth and a guide as to how we might escape it, which is great in the spirit of this conference, or to change stuff. So that's great. What happens next to us, you said, this is the attitude we need to have the opportunity to change course. But you said in an interview at Verso Books in Brooklyn, BC, before Corona, you said that people were not keen on revolutionizing a system in times of crisis. So I wanted to ask you this question because it burns my tongue, as we say in French. If we consider the pandemic being a crisis for itself, will we revolutionize something from now on, or will it happen? Is it delayed?
I think I will quote a Frenchman in response to you because it was Tocqueville who actually really kind of delivered that insight that in the midst of a crisis, people tend to be quite conservative, largely because they think that things are going to get better. So you can imagine you're in a big crisis, the economy isn't doing very well, you've maybe lost your job. You can hold on to the idea that in a few years, things will return to normal and everything will be fine again. It's after long periods of stagnation, he said, that people really start to kind of feel some sort of pressure to actually start to change things. That's really why we saw such the kind of build-up of support for change 5, 6, 7, 8 years after the financial crisis, because it was after that very slow and unequal recovery that people started to say, well, things aren't going to go back to normal, are they? So, this pandemic comes after that long period of stagnation, after a time when people were already saying things need to change. And of course, right now, the focus is always going to be on making sure that people can survive, that people can meet their daily needs, that people aren't, being evicted or becoming bankrupt. And all of those things mean a kind of a focus on, I suppose, crisis resolution rather than changing the fundamentals of the way our economy works. But I firmly believe that when we exit this crisis and move into the recovery, recovery will be, it may be associated with an initial boom in consumption because lots of people have saved up lots of money. They'll go out and spend that in the real economy. But all of those fundamental challenges that I've outlined, inequality, low wages, corporate power, climate breakdown, the lack of trust in democracy, none of these things are going away. And it won't be long after we have kind of exited this crisis, to the extent that we really ever will exit this crisis, that people start to say, things really aren't going to get better, are they? And that's the point at which they'll start demanding really radical change. And what I think is needed is for us at this point in time to be building up movements, building up a political project, so that when the average person turns around and says, I want things to be different, they can look around and see there are already these people fighting for that change. I'm going to join them.
This is great, because this is what we do right here, right now at the CPH conference. Thank you so much for your words, Grace. It was really wonderful. Great introduction. Sorry for the tech crash, but we know how it is in the conferences these days. I think it was just only a couple of minutes, but I'm glad we had the time to have this discussion with you. Thank you so much. Have a fantastic day yourself. We're going to continue this day here to redistribute economy also. Thank you very much. Bye.